Prosperity Flats, Montana Territory. October, 1887. The talk at the Mercantile was about Abel Marsh, and none of it was kind. They said he'd finally cracked, that the grief from losing his wife Martha in the spring had burrowed into his mind and hollowed it out. He was digging. Not for a well, not for a root cellar, but a great, long trench in the one place no sane man would ever turn a spade, the bottom of Deadfall Ravine. From the town's high ground, you could see him, a lone figure moving earth from sunup to sundown on the only piece of land the sheriff hadn't taken from him. "He's digging his own grave," muttered the blacksmith, spitting tobacco juice near the hitching post. A long one, at that the sentiment was shared. The ravine was a trap. It flooded in the spring, filled with impassable snow drifts in the winter, and baked in the summer. It was useless land, a geographic scar. And yet, Abel toiled. He ignored the shouted warnings from riders passing on the ridge above, their words snatched by the wind. He ignored the pitying looks from the few who bothered to make the trip down to his small, lonely cabin. They saw a man consumed by a pointless, mad labor, and they saw a tragedy. What they didn't see was the quiet, radical science taking shape in the earth. They didn't understand that Abel wasn't fighting the land, he was making a covenant with it. And they had no idea that in 3 months, during the worst blizzard the territory would ever know, their lives would depend on the madness they were all so quick to condemn. If you want to know how one man's grief-fueled project, born of injustice and ancient knowledge, became the single thing that saved a town from freezing starvation, then you'll want to stick around. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever seen a winter that could break a whole territory's spirit. The story of Abel's folly, as they called it, is a lesson in how the most brilliant solutions are often hidden in plain sight, dismissed as insanity right up until the moment they become the only thing that works. The people of Prosperity Flats thought the problem was the cold. Abel knew the real problem was the wind, and he was about to get underneath it. The trouble had started 6 months earlier, just after the thaw. Sheriff Corrigan, a man whose ambition was as wide as his gut, had arrived at Abel's ranch with 2 deputies and a sheaf of official-looking papers. He wasn't there for a social call. Citing an obscure territorial statute about unproductive usage and a freshly drawn survey map that conveniently redrew the boundaries of a pending railroad grant, Corrigan informed Abel that his prime grazing pastures, the high meadows his family had worked for 2 decades, were being repossessed. It was legal theft, clean and simple, orchestrated by the sheriff on behalf of distant investors he was secretly in league with. Abel, still numb from Martha's passing a month prior, didn't have the fight in him to contest it in a court run by Corrigan's cronies. He was left with his small cabin and a 100-acre parcel of what everyone considered junk land, dominated by the gaping maw of Deadfall Ravine. The sheriff had been magnanimous in his thievery. "You keep the ravine, old man," Corrigan had said with a smirk. "Maybe you can find a rock to cry on down there for weeks." Abel did just that. He sat on the lip of the chasm, the land stolen from him visible in the distance, and felt the emptiness of his life press in. But then, something shifted. It was a memory, faint at first, of his grandfather in the old country, a man who had farmed on a steep, wind-scoured mountainside where nothing was supposed to grow. He remembered his grandfather's words, spoken in a thick accent, "The frost is a wolf. It hunts on the wind. But it cannot hunt where it cannot run." His grandfather hadn't built high walls to block the wind, he had dug down, creating a deep, terrace pit, a sunken garden that captured the low winter sun and was shielded from the killing air. The earth itself was the blanket. Looking into the ravine, Abel saw not a grave, but a tool. The problem wasn't the brutal Montana cold, it was the relentless, soul-stealing wind that stripped every last calorie of warmth from man, beast, and building. A cabin on the flats was a battle, a constant war of feeding the stove to fight the cold air seeping through the chinks. But down there, 12 feet below the prairie grade, the wind was a rumor. The earth held a deep, steady temperature, a thermal anchor. He wasn't digging a grave. He was digging a harbor from the winter sea. His closest neighbor, Finn O'Connell, was the first to confront him directly. Finn was a good man, practical to a fault, who had tried to help Abel after Martha's death. He trudged down the dusty path to the ravine's edge one afternoon, his face a mask of genuine concern. Abel, he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. What in blazes are you doing down there? You've been at this for a month. Abel straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He had already cleared a space 70 feet long and nearly 15 feet wide, and was now deep in the process of digging it down. The piles of excavated earth were forming a high berm on the north side. I'm building a barn, Finn. And a garden. Finn stared, incredulous. A barn? In the bottom of a flood channel? Abel, the spring melt will turn this into a river. You know that. It'll wash away everything, animals and all. I've thought of that, Abel said calmly, pointing to a natural spillway on the far western end of the ravine. I'm building up the eastern end. The water will have to go the other way, away from this spot. I'm just changing its mind a little. Finn shook his head, unconvinced. His wife, Clara, had been watching Abel's progress with a growing sense of dread. He's working himself to death for nothing, she'd told Finn that morning, mending a shirt for their young son. He should be fixing his roof, cutting more firewood. January will be here before we know it. Her fear was practical. Winter in the territory was a predator. Every hour of autumn daylight was precious, meant for banking resources against the coming dark and cold. To see Abel squander that time on such a bizarre, doomed project felt like an affront to the very logic of survival. The community chorus agreed. He's tempting fate, said the pastor's wife. Pride before the fall, they saw a man thumbing his nose at the laws of nature, a man whose grief had made him reckless. They couldn't grasp that he was obeying a deeper law, one they had all forgotten, the law of thermal mass. He wasn't trying to defeat the cold with fire, he was going to trap the sun's warmth in the soil and hide from the wind. The work was methodical, guided by memory and pure physics. Abel wasn't just digging a hole, he was engineering a climate. First, he dug the main pit down to a depth of 8 feet. The north, east, and west walls were sheer earth, packed hard. This was his insulation. The massive berm of excavated soil piled against the north rim would serve as a windbreak, deflecting the prevailing Arctic gales up and over the ravine entirely. The southern face of the pit was the crucial element. He didn't dig it straight down. Instead, he angled it at roughly 45 degrees. This slope would face the low winter sun directly, maximizing the amount of light and heat that entered the structure. Next came the water. A small, year-round spring trickled from the ravine wall about 50 yards away. Abel spent a week digging a narrow, stone-lined channel, carefully graded to divert a portion of this water. The channel ran along the base of the northern wall inside the pit, a constant source of water for livestock that would also act as a massive thermal battery. Water holds heat far better than air. The flowing creek, entering the ground at a stable 40 degrees, would constantly radiate warmth into the enclosed space, preventing a hard freeze. For the roof, he used what he had. He built a low-pitched frame of salvaged lumber, stretching from the top of the southern slope to the berm on the north side. He couldn't afford much glass, but he'd managed to trade for a few dozen old panes from a collapsed greenhouse in a town miles away. He installed these in the center of the roof, creating a long skylight. The rest he covered with heavy canvas, which he painstakingly waterproofed with multiple coats of boiled linseed oil and beeswax, rendering it translucent. It wouldn't let in as much light as glass, but it would trap the heat and keep the snow off. Inside, he partitioned the space. The western third was for his 2 goats and a young milk cow he'd bought. The eastern 2/3 were for planting. He filled this section with the rich topsoil he had carefully set aside when he first began digging. He built raised beds, hauling in nutrient-rich leaf mold from a stand of cartonwoods down the ravine. By late November, it was finished. From the rim, it barely looked like anything, a long, low mound of earth with a strange, glistening spine. It looked like a burial mound. He's built a tomb for his animals, Finn remarked to Clara, shaking his head. But it wasn't a tomb. It was an ark. The first test came just after Thanksgiving. A cold snap, an appetizer for the main course of winter, descended on the territory. The temperature dropped to 5 degrees, with a wind that cut like a razor. On the flats, ranchers struggled to keep their herds from freezing. Finn spent 2 days and nights outside, trying to keep his cattle moving, their breath freezing on their muzzles, their ribs already starting to show as they burned calories just to stay alive. He lost a calf. In town, the stoves roared, devouring cords of precious wood. The windows of the mercantile were thick with frost. It was a normal, miserable start to a Montana winter. Curious and a little worried he hadn't heard from his neighbor, Finn made his way to Abel's property. He expected to find a disaster, frozen animals, a defeated old man. He walked to the edge of the ravine, the wind nearly taking his hat, and peered down. He saw no animals. He heard nothing but the howling wind above him. With a heavy heart, he scrambled down the steep path to the entrance of the structure, a heavy, insulated door set into the eastern wall. He knocked. The door swung open, and a wave of warm, humid air washed over him. It smelled of damp earth, hay, and living things. Abel stood there in his shirt sleeves, his face calm. Finn. Coming out of that wind, Finn stepped inside and his jaw dropped. The air was a comfortable 50 degrees. The cow and goats munched contentedly on hay in their pen, their coats sleek. Beyond them, under the milky light of the canvas and glass roof, were rows of impossible green, kale, chard, and hardy lettuces, thriving. A small, hand-dug channel of clear water gurgled peacefully along the back wall. How? Finn stammered, looking from the green plants to the placid cow. It's 5 degrees out there, Abel tapped the earthen wall beside him. It's 50 degrees in here, he said simply. The ground doesn't freeze 8 feet down. The sun gives the light, the water gives the heat, and the earth holds it all in. The wind can't get to it. Finn ran his hand along the dirt wall. It was cool, but not cold. It felt like a cellar wall in summer. The concept was so simple it was staggering. While everyone else was fighting a losing battle on the surface, Abel had just sidestepped the war entirely. Finn left that day with a dozen eggs and a head full of revolutionary thoughts, but the town remained skeptical. A fluke, the blacksmith insisted. Wait until real winter comes. Wait until January. That dirt tomb will be his coffin. Real winter came on January 12, 1888. It didn't arrive with a gentle dusting of snow. It came like an invading army, a solid wall of white that blotted out the sun and erased the horizon. The temperature fell, and it did not stop. It went from 0 to 10 below, then 20, then a mind-numbing 40 below zero. And it stayed there. The wind, a constant, shrieking gale out of the north, picked up the snow and hurled it sideways, sculpting the landscape into a frozen, alien world. Drifts buried fences, then sheds, then entire cabins up to their eaves. The territory was paralyzed. The train couldn't get through. Supply lines were cut. What had been a manageable winter turned into a siege. In Prosperity Flats, the initial bravado curdled into fear. Families huddled in a single room of their houses, burning anything that would catch fire, fence posts, furniture, books. The sound of coughing was everywhere. On the ranches, it was a massacre. Cattle, caught in the open, froze where they stood, becoming grotesque statues. Herds that had been worth a fortune were wiped out in a single night. The suffering was stark and democratic. It hit the wealthy and the poor alike. Sheriff Corrigan, isolated in his large, well-built house, found his authority meant nothing to a blizzard. His vast stores of firewood were dwindling faster than he'd thought possible, and his own herd of cattle, the prize he'd stolen Abel's land for, was being decimated on the very pastures he had seized. The camera of the mind cuts between scenes of desperation. We see Clara O'Connell, her face pale, rationing out the last of the salted meat to her son, his eyes wide with a hunger she can't satisfy. We see the blacksmith, his hands raw, trying to fix a broken stovepipe in the gale, only to have the metal freeze to his skin. We see a family miles to the south, their cabin completely buried, listening to the roof beams groan under the impossible weight of the snow, praying it doesn't collapse. And through it all, the wind howls, a monolithic, unending scream. The confident mockery of autumn was a distant, foolish memory. Now, there was only the cold, the hunger, and the terrifying realization that they were on their own, and they were not prepared. The problem was not the cold, it was the arrogance of thinking they had already tamed it. For 2 weeks, the world was a white hell. Finn O'Connell's situation had become critical. His last few cows were starving, too weak to stand. The hay was gone. The firewood pile was a ghost of its former self. His son, Thomas, was sick, his cough shallow and weak in the frigid air of their cabin. Clara looked at him with hollowed-out eyes. "We have to do something, Finn," she whispered, her breath pluming in the room. There's no food left, there was only one, desperate, insane hope. Abel. No one had seen or heard from him since the storm hit. The universal assumption was that he was dead, buried in his folly. But Finn remembered that wave of warm, earthy air. He remembered the green shoots. It was a long shot, a fool's errand, but it was the only shot they had. He bundled himself in every layer he owned, kissed his wife and son goodbye, and stepped out into the blizzard. The journey of less than a mile took him 2 hours. The wind was a physical force, a solid wall he had to push through. The snow was waist-deep, and he navigated by the tops of fence posts he knew by heart. When he finally reached the ridge overlooking Deadfall Ravine, he saw nothing. The entire landscape was a uniform, rolling sea of white. His heart sank. The blacksmith had been right. It was a coffin. But then, through the shrieking wind, he saw it. A faint, almost invisible wisp of steam, venting from a small pipe sticking out of a massive drift. It was the chimney for Abel's small wood stove. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. He half slid, half fell down the slope, landing in the deep powder near the source of the steam. He dug frantically with his raw hands until he found the top of the insulated door. He pounded on it, shouting Abel's name until his throat was raw. The door creaked open. Abel stood there, just as before, in a simple wool shirt. Behind him was a miracle. The air that flowed out was not just warm, it was alive. The cow lowed softly. The goats bleated. And the garden was flourishing. Rows of green vegetables grew in the humid air, beaded with condensation. On a small table sat a basket of potatoes and a dozen fresh eggs. Abel looked at Finn's frost-rimmed face and exhausted frame, and his expression softened. He didn't say, "I told you so," he just said, "You look half frozen, Finn. Come in." There's soup on the stove. In that moment, Finn wasn't just looking at a warm shelter. He was looking at the complete and total vindication of an idea. He was witnessing the impossible. Finn returned to his cabin not just with a sack of potatoes, a jug of milk, and a dozen precious eggs, but as a messenger of a new gospel. He stumbled in, covered in snow, and the sight of the food made Clara weep with relief. But it was the story he told that truly mattered. "It's warm, Clara," he said, his voice filled with an awe that bordered on religious reverence. "It's like summer down there. He has food growing. The animals are fine. He beat it. He actually beat the winter. News, even in a blizzard, has a way of traveling." Finn, revived by the food and warmth, made a second, more perilous journey into Prosperity Flats. He went straight to the Mercantile, where a dozen or so townsmen were huddled, their faces grim. He told his story. At first, they didn't believe him. It was too fantastical. "You're delirious from the cold, Finn," the blacksmith grumbled. But Finn's earnestness, and the fact that he was alive and had a story to tell at all, planted a seed of doubt. Sheriff Corrigan, who was there trying to commandeer what was left of the store's flour, scoffed openly. "Marsh is dead," he declared. "Buried in that ditch like the fool he is. This is a fairy tale, but desperation is a powerful acid that dissolves skepticism." The next morning, a small, ragged group of men, led by Finn, set out for the ravine. It was a pilgrimage of the desperate. When they arrived and saw the proof for themselves, the steam, the warm air, the impossible green life thriving under a blanket of snow, the mockery died on their lips. It was replaced by a stunned, humbled silence. They returned to town not as doubters, but as converts. Abel, a man who had only wanted to be left alone with his grief and his work, suddenly found himself the center of the territory's survival. He was reluctant. He had no desire to be a savior. But he couldn't turn away the hollow-eyed fathers and mothers who came to his door. He shared what he had: milk for the children, potatoes and greens for the families, eggs for the sick. But he did more than that. He taught them. As small groups huddled in the warmth of his sunken farm, he explained the principle. He took a potato and held it up. "You don't fight the storm," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You can't. You go under it. The earth is your shield. The ground beneath your feet holds more warmth than any fire you can build." The great blizzard finally broke in early February, leaving behind a shattered, humbled community. But it also left behind a lesson, paid for in hardship. The immediate aftermath was about survival, but the following spring was about revolution. The people of Prosperity Flats, and indeed the surrounding ranches, did not forget what they had learned in Abel's Ravine. They started digging. Led by Finn O'Connell, who had become Abel's most fervent disciple, work crews were formed. They didn't all dig massive structures like Abel's, they couldn't. Instead, they applied the principle to what they had. They dug their root cellars deeper, extending them and adding small, south-facing window wells covered with glass to create miniature greenhouses for starting seeds. They retrofitted their barns, digging down a few feet and banking the north walls with thick layers of earth and sod, creating semi-subterranean shelters for their animals that drastically reduced the need for winter feed. The technique, which became known as Abel's Follies with a new, deeply ironic respect, spread throughout the territory. Travelers would pass through and see the strange, sunken structures and ask what they were, and they would be told the story of the old man who dug a farm in a ravine and fed the town. Sheriff Corrigan became a ghost in his own town. His authority, built on land grabs and intimidation, had proven useless against the fundamental reality of a blizzard. He had offered rules and force, Abel had offered warmth and life. Corrigan's stolen pastures were barren and littered with the bones of his dead cattle. He had won the battle for the land but had lost the war for legitimacy. Within a year, he sold his holdings at a loss and left the territory, his name becoming a quiet curse. Abel never sought any credit. He continued to live his quiet life, tending his sunken garden, his solitude now punctuated by grateful neighbors who brought him news and shared their own successes with his method. He had turned his grief into a garden, his injustice into an innovation. He had found a way to make something live in the heart of a cold, empty place, and in doing so, had taught a whole community how to do the same. Years passed. The territory became a state. The story of the Great Blizzard of '88 and Abel's Folly became a piece of local folklore, a tale told to children on winter nights. Abel Marsh lived out his days in peace, eventually being buried on a small hill overlooking the ravine that had been his sanctuary and his legacy. The sunken farm itself was eventually abandoned, slowly filling with silt and returning to nature, its purpose served. But the principle it embodied endured, woven into the very architecture of resilience in that part of the country. Looking back, the story is more than just a clever survival tale. It's a parable. Today, we have names for what Abel was doing. We call it passive solar design, geothermal insulation, and sustainable agriculture. We use sophisticated instruments to measure thermal mass and solar gain, but the core idea is identical to the one an old, grieving rancher rediscovered with a shovel and a memory of his grandfather. He understood that the most powerful solutions often come not from confrontation, but from cooperation. He didn't try to conquer the winter with a bigger fire, he borrowed the enduring warmth of the planet itself. The world is full of people like Sheriff Corrigan, people who believe power comes from taking, from controlling, from building higher walls and asserting their will upon the world. They acquire the best land, the most resources, the loudest voices. But their strength is brittle. It shatters against the implacable forces of nature and necessity. And then there are the quiet ones, the Abel Marshes of the world. They are the observers, the listeners, the ones who look at a problem and see not an enemy to be defeated, but a system to be understood. Their power doesn't come from shouting, it comes from knowing where to dig. They prove that true resilience isn't about how fiercely you can fight the storm. It's about how wisely you can find shelter within it.